Jane had several children. Someone was asking her once, which one do you love the most? Jane thought for a minute. She said, the child that is sick, I love till they're well. The child that is going through some physical problems, I love them till we get past them. The child that is going through difficult times of hurt, heartache, depression, I love them till we get past those times. The child that is going through the problems is the child that I love the most at that point in time. And how true it is, and how we understand and appreciate the fact that in difficult times, those that are around us love us the most. We often feel like we're in pits. We often feel like we're in caves. We're in holes. We're down and out. Nothing can help us. Nothing can soothe us. Nothing can make us feel better. We can't get out. We can't climb out. The walls of that pit that we're often in are so smooth that there's no way to overcome them. There's no way to get out of there. And yet, when we face those difficult times, we know, we'll get right in a minute, when we face those difficult times, we know that we have a God. A God that helps us in the midst of our despair. A God that helps us in the midst of our troubles. A God that helps us in the midst of our difficulties. A God that is there. A God that is present. A God that will help us and pull us out of those difficult times. If you have your Bibles with you, turn to Psalm 27. It is there that I want to look this evening, because I want us to understand, as the psalmist begins, he asks this question. He says, the Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life, of whom shall I be afraid? Those are two excellent and interesting questions, to say the least. When do they occur? I want you to stop and think about something. This is, as the subtitle says, this is a Psalm of David. Now remember, those subtitles are not inspired. They're written by men. And sometimes they have who they believe the author to be by virtue of some things that have been found. And also sometimes they'll have the subject matter with regards to that psalm in some of the Bibles. This is believed to be, though, a Psalm of David. David didn't write all of the Psalms, but it's believed that he wrote this one. This was at a difficult time in David's life. David, in verses 2 and 3, is being attacked by enemies. David, as we see in verse 4 especially of our text, David seems to be cast out of the house of worship. Later on in verses 10 and 11, David has his parents seemingly that they have left and they have gone away for whatever reason. And on about verse 12, David is slandered. In other words, this is not a good time in David's life. If you were to ask David, if you'd say, is this one of your great days? Is this one of your great months? Is this one of your great weeks? David would say, no, it's not. Look at what I'm going through. Look at what's happening to my enemies are against me. My parents have left me for whatever reason. I'm being kicked out of the house of worship. I'm being talked about by others. No, this is not a good time. This is not a good day. Well, in the midst of that, David tells us, though, how he got out of that pit of despair. When he asked that question, who shall I fear? Who shall I be afraid of? Well, the ultimate answer is, David, nobody. Well, how could you do that? How could you say that? Well, let's find the answer. I think in a lot of ways the answer is found in one verse of this text. If you jump on down in Psalm 27, David makes a statement beginning at verse 8. Look what he says. He says, when you said, seek my face, my heart said within me, my face, Lord, I seek. This verse is a tremendous verse. And we look at this verse and we're going to kind of dissect this one verse, and we're going to find four things that God gives to us to help us get out of the pits when we're in them. What does he do? What does he tell us? Well, the first thing he does is he tells us, seek his face. Now, I want you to notice something about this verse, something that's very interesting. And a lot of times when we're just reading and we're not dissecting and not really looking in depth, we don't catch this. But notice what he says. David says in verse 8, he says, when you said, seek my face. This is in the plural. This is a promise that God, or a command that God had given. And David says, when you said for us, for mankind, to seek your face, then my heart said within me. He then changes it to the singular. He goes from, God, you made this promise to everybody. Then I said within my heart, I said within me, I'll seek your face. See, we need to seek the face of God. When do we seek the face of God? Well, we seek the face of God at all times, don't we? But it's when we're going through difficulties, when we're having problems, that we really turn our face to God. Think about with me just some examples of this in the Bible. Think about when Hezekiah was told, get your house in order, get your affairs in order because you're going to die. What did it say? That the very next thing was that he turned his face to the wall. That, in some ways, is a symbolic or a move, a gesture, a sign of repentance. But then he turned to the Lord. In 1 Samuel, another example, in 1 Samuel, the 30th chapter, when David is really down and out. Remember when David had gone against the enemy, and the enemy had come in kind of behind David. David had gone off with his men to fight, and the enemy had come in behind David, and they'd taken everything. They'd taken their wives, they'd taken their belongings, and in 1 Samuel, the 30th chapter, they were left with nothing, basically. And when David and his men, his warriors, came back to home base, to see the wives and the children, to get some home cooking, to be in their own possessions, and they weren't there. But David's own men wanted to turn against David. And David in Psalm 30 says about verse 8 that he inquired of the Lord. He prayed to God. He sought God's face. Well, we could see it with Moses as he led the children of Israel. We see it in Jeremiah. Jeremiah went through a great amount of difficulties. He was a man of God, preaching the gospel because he was a prophet of God. He was a speaker for God. And so in Jeremiah, the 18th chapter, the 20th verse, Jeremiah went to seek the face of God, to inquire of God, to cry to God when he was going through his great difficulties. But one that's interesting, and there's a whole lot of other examples of this, but one that as I was thinking about this that was kind of intriguing to me is found in Jonah, the 1st chapter, the 5th verse. In Jonah, the 1st chapter, remember, that's basically when Jonah is running away from God, right? God had told him, go to Nineveh, preach the gospel, and he said, nope, no, I don't want to do that. Now, there are several reasons why he probably didn't want to do that. These were two nations that didn't get along. He possibly didn't want to hear, or want Nineveh to hear the gospel. In other words, he didn't want his enemy, didn't want those people that hated his people to hear the truth, and thus to be proselytes and to follow the truth. And so he said, no, I don't want to do that. And so he ran away from God. Well, we know the story, because that's the story, you remember, of that big fish that swallows up Jonah. Do you remember in Jonah chapter 1, verse 5, when the storm is going on and the storm is raging, that even the, if you will, the sailors of the boat who were characterized as being heathens, that they were praying and they asked Jonah to pray to his God. You see, it's when we go through those difficult times in life. It's when we go through and we face those tremendous problems, and we face those heartaches and hurts. We face those pits in life. That what should we do? That's when we automatically should turn our face to seek God. How many times do people walk away from God because you know what they do? They blame God for their problems. They blame God for their difficulties. They blame God for what they're going through. And it's a whole lot easier to shake your finger in the face of God and to blame God and walk away from Him than it is to turn to Him and say, okay, God, help me with it. Let's get this fixed. And yet, Paul reminds us in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 17 that we should steadfastly continue in prayer. That we should be individuals that's Romans 12:12, and 1 Thessalonians 5:17 says to pray without ceasing. That we should be individuals that constantly
are involved with and seeking the face of God through prayer. So while it should always be true that we're seeking the face of God no matter what's going on in our life, no matter whether it's difficult times or good times, no matter whether we're going through great times of wonderful expectations and meeting those expectations and just having a high time in life, or whether it is in the deep valley of that pit, that valley of despair, we need to learn to seek God's face, to turn to Him, to ask Him, to go to Him. As the song goes, where could I go, oh, where could I go? Seeking refuge for my soul, needing a friend to save me in the end. Where could I go but to the Lord? And the reality of it is the Lord hears us, doesn't He? I used to hear an old preacher, as he would pray, he would end his prayers, and I often thought how kind of strange it was that he would end his prayer this way, but I understand now the reasoning for it. But he would end his prayers this way: hear us, O God. Well, you might say, well, God hears us. That's kind of a redundant statement. But it is the pleading, and if you think about it and you go through a lot of the Psalms, it's kind of what you hear. It's what the psalmist keeps saying. Hear us, O God. Listen, O God. Give ear to me, O God. We seek God's face. And so in the midst of our problems, in the midst of our difficulties, in the midst of our times in which life has seemingly turned us inside out and upside down and moved us in every direction instead of the direction that we want to go in, we need to learn, as the psalmist did it here in Psalm 27, to seek the face of God. But then secondly, notice that we need to express our feelings to God. That's one of the things that's always interesting when you begin to read the Psalms. The psalmist never holds back on his feelings. The psalmist never says, I can't really let God have it. The psalmist turns loose. The psalmist lets God know his feelings. You see, sometimes when we go to God in prayer, we tend to think we've got to have this sanctimonious tone, and we've got to have all these huge highfalutin words, and we can't use any emotion, we can't have any tears, we can't have any difficulties, we can't have any heartaches, we can't show God anything with regards to what's going on in our life. But yet, here's the psalmist. The psalmist said, I'll seek you. Do not, notice what he says in the very next verse, do not hide your face from me. Do you think he said that in a high sanctimonious way? Lord, don't forsake or don't hide your face from me. Or do you think he said it with great emotion? I believe he said it with great emotion. When we go to God, if we are crying tears, we don't have to dry up our eyes and say, okay, God doesn't need to see my tears. God doesn't need to see what's going on with me. Matter of fact, didn't the Hebrew writer in Hebrews chapter 2, chapter 5, didn't he make the statement in verse 7, who in the days of his flesh, when he offered up prayers and supplications with crying and vehement tears. Who's he talking about? Jesus. When he offered up his prayers and supplications, what did he offer them up with? According to the Hebrew writer, he opened them up with tears, crying, and not just a little sobbing, but great tears came down his cheeks. I've had I guess you could say, the misfortune of hearing parts of 2 phone calls from individuals in very public places in the last couple of weeks that I'd really wish that I hadn't heard. I was at the gym one night. I was working out, and this young girl that we've never really talked, but I'm really sure I've known her for many, many years. And she was working out, and she was also on her phone. That's one thing that young people can do that us old folks can't do. That is, they can text and do all kinds of things on their phone while they're working out, and us old folks, we're just sitting there sweating. It's a big difference in people in an age. This girl was on her phone, and as I was at a weight machine pushing little weights, and she walked past me, and I heard her say in a very strong voice, "Did you just hang up on me?" And then she went into a room, In a few minutes, she came back, and she was wiping the tears from her eyes. That was real emotion. Also, unfortunately, yesterday, Suzanne and I were out shopping for Christmas, and we had gone our ways in one of the stores, and I was looking through some stuff, and this guy walked down an aisle, and he was on his phone. And here's what he was saying. Do you think this is going to help our relationship? Do you? Do you think this is going to help our relationship? Well, just hang up. Yeehaw! Thank you, Lord, for putting me in a place where I now want to go hug my wife and tell her thank you, I love you. Those people were angry with some other people. And I tell you those stories not to be personal, but just to say, okay, here's some folks that were going through some difficulties with some other folks, and they showed true emotion. They showed true feeling. When we go to God, we can do the very same thing. If Jesus could do the same thing, why can't we? Sometimes I feel like we try to clear it up and try to kind of polish it up and try to make it a little bit better than it really is. But you go through the Psalms, and one of the things you find out is that when he needed to, he shook his finger in the face of God. When he felt upset at God, he'd shake even his fist at God. Now he'd get over it. He'd realize, he'd ask God to forgive him. He'd say, wait a minute. If he accused God of something, he'd say, wait a minute. But he never was sorry for the emotions which he felt. There's examples of that in the Bible. Not only Jesus, but how about in Ezra? In Ezra, the 10th chapter, in verse 1, it says that while he was praying and confessing with great tears, praying to God. Ezra, a great reformer, rebuilding, if you will, and revitalizing and reviving Israel and bringing them back home. As he has told the people, and if you get the context there in Ezra chapter 9, he has told them basically to stay away from pagan idolatry and paganism and false gods. And so in chapter 10, verse 1, it begins, when he was praying. And it's interesting to note that the people then began to pray and to cry at what they had done with regards to their relationship with God. But here we are in the midst of a problem. What can we do? Well, we can express our feelings to God. And we can let Him know exactly what we're feeling. But then thirdly, this psalmist in Psalms 27 reminds us that in the midst of the pits and in the midst of the problems of life, we really need to abandon ourselves to God. We really need to learn to turn ourselves over to God. Notice what he says. He says, Lord, when you said, seek my face, I said to me, Lord, your face I seek. It's you, Lord. It's you that I'm going to follow. It's you that I'm going to give my life to. It's you that I'm going to listen to. It's you that I'm going to let lead my life. It's you that I'm going to let be my God. That's not always easy, is it? It's not always easy to turn it over to God. There was a lady one time that went to her new preacher. He was young. He had just gotten out of school and first work, and she went to him. And she said, I want you to answer me a question. Okay. And basically her question to the young preacher was, how many times do you have to pray for something? Well, one time. God will hear your prayer. She said, well, I asked that question because she said, I just don't know. Well, he said, what do you mean you don't know? She said, well, I'll have to admit to you, there was a preacher somewhere in my past, I can't recall, but he just made the statement one time in preaching that the reason certain things in our lives didn't always come out the way we wanted to was because we didn't pray enough. I said, well, there's nothing wrong with praying the same subject several times. Jesus did in the Garden of Gethsemane. But is that necessary? And she continued to tell her young preacher, I can't help but think that the problems in my life and the problems in the people that I love's lives is because we haven't prayed enough for them. My thought in thinking about that is this: has she really turned her life over to God? Does she really realize the strength of God? Does she really realize, as Job said in Job 26, verse 7, talking about God, who spread out the world, basically, as Job says, kind of on a string. In other words, He expanded, He created everything. He made this world and He made all things there, that He is the one with great power. He's the one that has all things. And I wonder if she understood that. I don't know. Did she comprehend the idea of all things work together for good? Did she comprehend, as Jesus said in the Garden of Gethsemane, not my will, but yours be done? I don't know. But I hope we do. And I hope that when we look at this verse, that we think about, in the midst of my troubles, I need to really realize that I need to turn to God more. That not only do I need to seek His face, but I need to understand that I need to let Him lead. And I need to be willing to follow. That I need to be willing to listen instead of talk. That I need to be willing to watch and to wait instead of trying to do it all on my own. That I really need to seek His face and to seek His will. Isn't that what James said in James the 4th chapter? That we ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will do this and that. That's what James said. James says we ought to understand it's the Lord's will, it's the Lord's way. And so we go based upon the Lord. It was Joseph that reminded his brothers in Genesis 50 and verse 20. Remember when they had sold him off, sold him what they thought was a life of slavery, and in some ways it was, but he kind of came out on the good end of that. You remember that story in the book of Genesis? And you remember that when the brothers got back and when he had revealed himself to them, and do you remember that they were penitent because they were afraid he was going to do something to them? And he told them in Genesis 50 and verse 20, he says, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Do we trust in God enough to say, we're going to turn it over to you, God. We're laying it at your feet. We're bringing it before you. Here it is. I can't carry it anymore. I can't get through this burden. I can't get out of this pit. I can't overcome this obstacle without you. The psalmist said, Lord, when you said seek your face, I said to myself, I said within me, your face, Lord, will I seek. Are we letting God be God and letting us be us? Or are we trying to play God in the midst of our problems, in the midst of our difficulties? But then fourthly, and the fourth lesson we learn is to plead the promises of God. You see, when you look at this, verse 8, one of the things you see is that the psalmist says, when you said God, then I said. In other words, I responded to your promise. I responded to what you said. I did exactly what you said. And think about what he's doing. He's offering this back up as a prayer to God. There are books out now that talk about praying the Psalms and praying the promises of God. And you think about it, you say, well, why do we need to pray the promises of God back to God? Doesn't God remember what He promised us? Doesn't God remember what He told us? Doesn't God remember what He has laid out for us? And are we simply reminding a God that cannot lie and a God that doesn't forget? Are we simply reminding Him of that which He already knows? Have you ever thought about it from the standpoint of that's a time in which God is listening to your heart. And when you begin to pray back His promises to Him, you're simply showing Him your heart. I'm not a gambler. Don't believe that gambling's right by virtue of the Bible. The Bible tells us that gambling's wrong. But occasionally, when there's nothing else to watch on TV, I'll watch ESPN and watch the World Series of Poker. And the one thing those guys, most of them won't do is they won't show their hand. And even when they won, if they don't have to show their hand through the rules of the game, they won't show what they had. They won't show what their hand was. God has shown us His hand by His promises. But God also wants us to show our hand to Him. Well, preacher, in and of itself, isn't that argument somewhat redundant? Because if God gave us these promises, and God knows these promises, and God's looking at our heart, but doesn't God know everything, and so thus doesn't He really know our heart? Isn't maybe He trying to get us in tune with our own heart? You see, I believe that we can pray the promises of God. That we can remind Him that He promised that as far as the east is from the west, so far He'll remove our sins from us. I believe we can remind Him of the fact that He's promised that He'll never leave us nor forsake us. That He'll work all things together for good to those that love the Lord and are called according to His purpose. I believe that we can remind God of these promises. We can remind God of the promise that He's told us that He'll watch over us and that He'll be kind to us. I believe that we can remind God of the promises that, yea, though we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, we can fear no evil because we know He's with us. And on we could go with the promises of God. I believe we can pray those promises. In the midst of our problems, in the midst of being in that pit in life, and we're going to run into them, we can pray to God and remind Him of those promises that He's given to us. We're not belittling Him. We're not testing Him. We're not trying to show Him up. We're just saying, God, we remember these things. And in our relationship, here's what we're asking for. Just what You promised us. And so we can pray the promises of God. But then if you're there in Psalm 27, I want you to look in verse 14. Here's the answer. Here's the answer, I believe, to it all. Wait on the Lord, be of good courage, and He'll strengthen your heart. Wait, I say, on the Lord. Peter Croper was a great violinist in Great Britain. One day, some group that owned one of these very expensive Stradivarius let him borrow it for a while. 268 years old at the time. Beautiful instrument from the standpoint of just looking at it, its aesthetics. Beautiful from its tone. And he, being a great violinist, could make that instrument just almost sing. One day, in rehearsal, he went to walk across the room and he tripped and he fell. And the Stradivarius broke into several pieces. Oh, he was heartbroken. First of all, that someone had let him, or a group rather that owned this, had let him borrow this instrument, and he'd destroyed it. Heartbroken that the Stradivarius, which is so very rare, that it could not be replaced, and he knew that. Heartbroken because he didn't know what he was going to do or how he was going to pay it back. And heartbroken because of what was such a beautiful piece, both from looks and sound, would be quiet from then on. Croper found out of a man that was a master, a skills man that could put this instrument back. And so he contacted him, and he carried the pieces in a box, and he carried them to the man. And before long, the man called him up and told him to come get it. And he did, and he went and he looked at it. And he couldn't tell where it had been broken in pieces. And he went to play it. And the sound was, as some said, that heard it even richer than what it was before it was broken. You know, God takes pieces in our life, and the pieces that as it breaks down, and He takes them and He puts them back together. And He puts them back together far better than what they ever were to begin with. Yeah, as we've talked about before, there are pits in life. But as we're looking up in the midst of that pit, we'll learn to seek God's face and turn it all over to God, to express to Him our hearts as we abandon our will for His will and remind Him of what He's promised to us. God will help us out. Oh, what a great God we serve. And so life does get difficult. But as the psalmist said, You said, Lord, seek my face. And I said, Your face, Lord, I will seek. This evening, if you're not a New Testament child of God, if you need to change the direction of your life, if you want to follow the Lord, you need to confess that you believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God. You need to be immersed so that the sins in your life will be washed away. You need to ask for the prayers of the church, whatever the case may be. Won't you come? While together we stand and sing.